In the world of finance, we talk about that there is a wall of money looking for investments. Investors, investment bankers are crying out, please help us to find the projects, to finance, to fund, to invest in. I was a banker eons ago, once in ancient times, and we also talked back then, it's almost 35 years ago, and we also talked about a mountain of demand for infrastructure investments. It struck me then, and it strikes me now, not much has changed. But you have these two, a mountain of demand and a wall of money. And for at least 35 years, there are people older than me who says that it's always been like this. And I think it's time to ask the question, why nothing happens? Why this mountain of demand keeps getting bigger? And the wall of money is still screaming, we need investments to match our liabilities, says the pension fund, says the insurance company, etc. I think part of the answer to this question, or this conundrum, is that we speak different languages in the public sector and the private sector. In the private sector, 700 years ago, we invented the balance sheet with double entry bookkeeping. That gave us the possibility to understand wealth. In the public sector, we are still, 700 years later, stuck with only talking about the cash flow, the budget, the fiscal space. There is no real concept in the public sector about wealth or net worth. In the public sector, we're talking about financing, which means adding debt. This is not very popular in the public sector. The public sector wants funding. Funding is usually done by either raising taxes or user fees. Not very popular that either. So what James is alluding to is that there is an alternative way which a lot of countries, a lot of cities have understood, which is using the assets that governments around the world already owns. We call it public wealth. It is the commercial assets. It is a virtual gold mine, if you like, that we are all sitting on. It is the real estate in every city. It is the operational assets like transportation companies, airports, ports, etc. And the rule of thumb that I have found to be almost universal is that these commercial assets, they have a value which is at least 1 to 2 times GDP. Now that's a lot of money. And the whole thesis, which is not really a thesis because it's working, it's been done for more than 50 years, 40, 50 years, is that if you manage these assets more professionally, you could actually get a yield out of them that could help you as a public official to fund infrastructure investments, sustainable, or schooling, education, fighting opioids, or whatever problem there is. And the trick to do this is in the institutional setup. Because we do have examples in the US and elsewhere of institutions that are trying to do this, like the New York Port Authorities and many others, that sit on developable land but are not able to actually do it. And one of the main reasons is how you do this institutional setup. So the trick, or the secret sauce here is really in the governance of this institution, that it's independent, at arm's length from short-term political influence, and that it's transparent. And if you think about many of the US institutions, that it has one single objective. It can't have both a policy objective and a commercial objective. Because if we're talking about commercial assets, so you're only supposed to put into this portfolio commercial assets, it should only be value maximization. Now, why hasn't this happened in the US, in the world, to a much greater extent? One of the reasons is, as I alluded to earlier, is that the public sector do not have a balance sheet, so they don't see this value. There is not even one city in the world that has a list of assets, which is quite fascinating. That goes back to the balance sheet again. So all the governments in the world, they know what they owe in terms of debt, because that we learned from the Asian financial crisis to the big financial crisis in 2008. So we've all built up public debt offices, be it on a local level or a national level. But there's not one city, barring maybe one, which is a couple, Hong Kong, Singapore, and New Zealand. They're actually doing this quite well. Who has a list of assets and has a value on them at current use. So doing this asset map is really the first step to understand how can my city use this idea or this concept or this model, whatever you want to call it, in a better way and get a yield. Because if you manage to institutionalize this in a professional way and get the professionals, which is not very difficult, the difficulty is having the political will to do it. You would be able to generate a yield that would at least double. In some cities in the US, which we have analyzed, it could even triple the amount of infrastructure investment that we are currently doing. And in some US cities, it would even, a 3% yield, which is very modest, would even be more than those cities are generating in taxes today. So that's quite provoking for you and should wake you up to, I hope, water your and inspire you to see where the money for funding, not financing, could come from to do all the sustainable investments that you are thinking about and considering. Thank you.